Hello, my name is Jason Peck, and this is a Comedy Q&A interview with Professor Richard Martin. In this interview, we talk about Greek playwright Aristophanes, who's also known as the father of comedy. Professor Martin has taught at several universities, including Stanford, and is also the author or co-author of several books. So if this is a subject that interests you, maybe check out one of his courses or take a look at one of his books. In the meantime, please enjoy this interview with Professor Richard Martin. Hello, is that Professor Martin?
Yes, is this Jason?
It is, yes. So anyway, for people unfamiliar with the work of Aristophanes, do you think there's any combination of modern comedians that you may be familiar with who could sort of, that would be similar to his work?
It's tough because there isn't, it really would have to be a combination. There is no one person or troupe that does it. And I'm thinking it would have to be something like Monty Python, first of all.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You're thinking of the collective work of Monty Python, and combined with something like Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Kimmel. And what I mean by that is it's topical, it's political, it's like stand-up in a way because you get these jokes that zing local demagogues in Athens and the people sitting in front of the stage right in the theater who are getting satirized and parodied and insulted right to their face.
Right.
Even Colbert doesn't have that because he doesn't have people in the administration right in front of him in the theater, but he has them on TV.
Sure.
So there's that kind of satirical, insulting stand-up behavior combined with these fantastic plots, the kind of thing that Monty Python came up with all the time. So if you can imagine, furthermore, something in musical form with lots of interludes, lots of singing and dancing and carousing. So it's got a very strict formal kind of feel to it with the kind of hilarity that the Monty Python routines take over.
Right.
That would be a little bit like the combination that it must have been. Okay.
Got it. Now, you mentioned demagogues that he was satirizing. Would you be able to just really roughly paint a picture of what Greece was like during Aristophanes' time? They were in the middle of a war, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
And so we know that the Peloponnesian War, so-called, lasted from 431 to 404 BC.
Got it.
And Aristophanes had his first play produced in 427 BC in Athens. So already the war had been grinding on for 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
So when we say Greece, of course, we know most about just one city-state, Athens, and the Peloponnesian War was basically Athens versus Sparta, but it became almost a regional world war since Athens had many allies and Sparta had a number of allies.
Okay.
And so Athens is the place we know most about because that's the place theater seems to have been born in the way that we have it, and Aristophanes is the only surviving comedian. He did probably 40 or so plays in his lifetime, but we only have 11 of them. And we just have bits and pieces of the other guys who were competing against him.
Right.
So in a few sentences, the Peloponnesian War started with the Spartans invading Athenian territory pretty regularly every spring and summer.
Okay.
Pericles had the idea of bringing people from the outlying districts in Attica, the area around Athens, bringing them inside the city walls, which caused, on the one hand, it was a good defensive move. On the other hand, it caused all kinds of crowding and probably helped lead to disease. There was a big plague in which Pericles himself lost a son.
Okay.
So that was all just before Aristophanes begins producing his comedy. Then there's a let-up in the fighting around 422, 421, and then it resumes again a couple of years later, and finally Athens loses this war because they lose their fleet of ships on which they depend. So after that, the Athenian democracy goes on for a bit, but it's never like the golden years. So what we're seeing is really the last couple of decades of the golden age of Athens in Aristophanes.
Okay, got it. And just so I'm clear, Sparta was a part of Greece, right?
Yeah, there was no official country of Greece until 1821. In the 19th century.
Okay, yes.
So it was just a collection of about 800 city-states, things ranging from maybe 5,000 people to 100,000 people, who shared a language, who shared pretty much the same set of divinities and cult practices, and they saw each other as sharing a culture, but there was no organized country of Greece.
Right. So it wasn't quite a civil war then, because they were in the same region but separate.
It's not, because the Spartans have a slightly different dialect. They have different gods that they pay attention to more than the Athenians. It's more like I don't know, it'd be like English against Scots or something.
Okay.
They share territory. They share, to some extent, the same language.
Yes.
But interestingly enough, the translators of Aristophanes in the early 20th century, when they wanted to do other dialects like Boeotian or Spartan dialect, they would often use Lowland Scots to represent the other, whereas the Athenians would be speaking, more Southern English.
Got it. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that was the time that he was writing in. There was a war happening, and so they would. Am I correct? I mean, I have a vague knowledge, nothing like your own, obviously. I have a vague knowledge of Aristophanes. I've read a couple of his plays. I've read Acharnians, Lysistrata, Assembly Women. So I've read those in the past, and I've read, there was a book, I think it was the Theatre of Aristophanes by Kenneth McLeish, I think it was. I got hold of that book many years ago. Now, what I'm trying to get to is, so he would write his plays, but am I correct in understanding they were only performed during like a festival or a competition?
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. There were two festival periods in Athens each year, and they would be the same festivals at which tragedies were produced,
right,
and comedies on different days. So the major festival called the Dionysia, in the worship of Dionysus, would be, that's the kind of top shelf competition. And apparently they had 5 different comic poets staging one play apiece. So Aristophanes would be up against 4 other guys. And then the judges would award first, second, third prize. They'd also award a prize for an actor, starting later in the 4th century, best actor. So it was a lot like the dramatic festivals that we, competitions we still have.
Right.
But it was a one-time deal. So that was it. It's not like a movie or not like a Broadway play you can go to. You can see Cats on Broadway for 20 years. That was your one shot. One day in maybe March 425, you could see the Acharnians.
Right. And then that's it.
That's it.
If you didn't see it, too bad for you.
Well, yeah, they developed a book trade later in the 5th century, and you could, with difficulty, the elite who could read, which might have been maybe 2 out of 10 people, could actually purchase a scroll you'd go to apparently to the bookseller and you'd say, I want a copy of a couple of things by Aristophanes, and then it's like an early copy shop. They'd have a slave in the back room who would carefully transcribe, and sometimes not so carefully, the master copy that they had, and then you would come by a week later and pick it up. That's apparently the way it worked.
Right.
So it's not like they've got multiple copies and you just purchase them. It would take a lot of effort to actually get a copy of the book.
Right. And so they, presumably then, I think you mentioned earlier on, he originally wrote something like around 40 plays. So presumably they would have had maybe all 40, or at least as close a number, and then you could purchase whatever you wanted.
Probably, yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's very unclear how we ended up only getting the ones that we have.
Right.
Because we know the titles of the others.
Yeah.
And, we have little pitiful scraps. They fill one volume, and some of them are like 2 words.
Yeah.
But certain plays got into the curriculum, and they were guaranteed more success because little Athenian boys, all through the period of the Roman Empire and the early Byzantine period, would have to read like the Plutus, the Wealth. That was one of the favorite ones.
Got it. Okay. Now, I was looking at your information on the Stanford website, and I, obviously I do a bit of background reading about before whoever I'm speaking to, and there was something that leapt out at me. I hope it's okay if we can just talk a little bit about the course that you're running. Is that okay?
Sure.
Because what I was reading, it said, at Stanford, you teach the course Classics 318, Aristophanes, Comedy and Democracy. And the description on the website says, intensive study of 3 plays in Greek, so not in English, in Greek. And it's Knight's Peace, and what is the pronunciation of that? The last one, the original word for assembly women?
Ecclesias.
Sorry, say that again?
So it's Ecclesia Zeusai. Am I breaking up?
Yeah, you did just momentarily there.
Yeah, and it's the word ecclesia means assembly, and they make a verb out of it, to go to the assembly, and they put a feminine ending on it, so it's basically women who go to the assembly.
Got it. Okay. And then the rest of the description says, and the rest in the corpus in English, got it, with reference to formal features. What do you mean by formal features there?
Well, this is something you wouldn't really see clearly in the English translation, but each part of the play has a different meter in Greek. So the spoken parts are in iambic trimeter meter. Then the chorus marches on to what's called the anapestic meter, which is like ba-ba-bum, 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 ba-ba-bum. Must have been to some sort of music. Then there are lyric songs in these very complicated meters that recall the poetry of Sappho and other lyric poets. So that's what I'm saying. In order to recreate it, you have to imagine something like, Oklahoma or Cats or an American musical in order to capture the kind of musical differentiation. So those are some of the formal features. Then there are another 2. There's one called the Agon, Agon, which is the contest. And it's a very careful kind of schema as to how 2 major figures duke it out on stage verbally.
I see, right.
And it's another one finally called the Parabasis, the going forward, where the chorus kind of comes forward on the stage and speaks to the audience directly, almost like in the persona of Aristophanes himself.
I see.
And they give advice and talk about political issues.
Right. And would they maybe throw it open for audience interaction at that point?
That's a great question, because it seems that sometimes they make reference to, look at so-and-so in the audience is doing such and such. Yeah. Now, whether that's a stylized bit or something which is more like, David Letterman actually tossing things out to the audience and hearing back. it's an open question. I love to imagine that the audience is interacting at all these times.
Right. Because, I mean, I obviously I don't really want to extrapolate, but, I guess I'm kind of a little bit more free to do that than you are. I mean, there would have been a lot of interaction in Shakespeare's day, and then later on in the Restoration period. So the silent audiences, in my understanding, is a much later thing where audiences
I
don't
think
speak.
I think that's probably a 20th century invention, if anything. I think so. I'm with you. I would extrapolate, frankly, and say you've got at least 5,000 people in the audience. First of all, it's open air. You've probably got guys selling peanuts or something in the aisles, and we know that they made a lot of noise by kicking the back of the seats with their feet, because Plato has some references to that. So I'm sure that it's a rowdy audience, and you've got actors who must be really bawling out through their masks in order to reach the back rows in a theater that holds at least 5,000 people in the 5th century.
Right. I do just want to finish with the description, but just before of your course, but just before I do, something that's just come to my mind as you mentioned the masks. Now, if you, I'm not sure if you've got a theatre background, as in...
I proudly appeared in productions of the South Boston Players, and
nice.
High school, and so real amateur stuff. But I love live theater.
Okay, the reason for me asking is you mentioned about the masks. Now, if, in your opinion, in your educated opinion, if a theatre company or myself or anybody was to try to stage Aristophanes today, do you think is it better to try and stage it as they did it, replete with the masks, or lose masks altogether?
That's a great question, and much as I would love to try to do it, in an authentic historical sort of like early music troops who really want an archaeological version.
Yeah,
I don't think it would fly, because we associate masks with a completely different realm of experience. We think of like Halloween, or we think of kabuki or no drama or something like that. So I think it would just be too weird for Anglo-American audiences. Although, the BBC did wonderful productions of tragedy, the few that I've seen Aristophanes with masks, they don't carry very well, because, again, you're always defeating the audience's expectation to see reactions on the face, and you can't do reactions on the face. Well, some people would claim you can actually do them with masks if you have an expert actor, as you find you see in kabuki and in no theater. So, but it's just really difficult. Right,
and there would be that an additional level of distance. I think they've got the distance of time as it is. And then you've got the distance of masks.
Yeah. I mean, so that's the big question. Do you want to make it alien and strange, kind of Brechtian theater? Or do you want to make it really like something you could see on Broadway or TV?
Yeah. And so then with that in mind, let's assume then a company's going to stage some Aristophanes, they decide to lose the masks. What about the references? There are a lot of, the references to Cleon. We can sort of figure out, from what I've read, he was, as you were mentioning, he was a demagogue. So we could, that would be like a modern comparison. We're talking about Hitler or Mussolini, something like that. But in terms of other...
No, not to mention later figures, yeah.
Yep, a lot of later figures, that's right. But in terms of like other references, more local references, is it worth completely removing those and updating those, or do you think it would be good to keep those?
So again, it's a sort of archaeological instinct versus the instinct to connect directly.
Yeah.
And I have to say that it might turn people off if you keep them. If you're going to really keep things, I would say go whole hog and produce the thing in Greek. And
right.
In fact, King's College London does this. I think every other year they do a Greek play. I've seen them perform The Wasps of Aristophanes in Greek, and it was hilarious. They did musical numbers and everything, but you have to know Greek to teach in Greek to get it. On the other hand, not to blow our own horn at Stanford, but our grad students every year put on something through Stanford Classics in Theater, and they take an Aristophanes play or sometimes a Plotine Latin comedy, and they totally morph it into current day terms. So they've done the clouds in terms of deconstruction being taught in the school. They've done Women at the Assembly in terms of Occupy Wall Street. So they've done some brilliant things, and they're all commercial message, all online through our website, Stanford Classics. And I think that's the way to go. The audiences love it. It's pure comedy, but the basic inspiration is Aristophanic.
Right. Nice. Okay. So just to cycle back to the end, I know we've sort of broken this up and gone on a little digression here.
That's very comic too, but yeah.
I do want to just cycle back to the last sentence of the description of your course. The final sentence being, and a focus on how old comedy related to the democratic practices of Athens. Would you be able to tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, this is something we're always exploring in the seminar, but in the broadest outline, in Athens, you have three different physical spaces in which you gather a whole bunch of citizens and you decide on crucial issues. And number one is the ecclesia, the assembly, where you have at least 6,000 people on a hill, which is just across the street, basically, from the Theater of Dionysus. So you can see the theater from the so-called Pnyx, where the assembly met. Then there's the courts in the Agora on the other side of the Acropolis Hill. There's a whole system of courts where you have juries, sometimes 5,000 people on a jury. So there are these big judgmental spaces where people decide on policy. They rank each other out, they make speeches, the court, the assembly, and finally the theater. So the theater is like one of these performance spaces in terms of the topography of Athenian democracy and the ideology of Athenian democracy. It's art that really matters. It talks to what's going on that year, that month. It calls for judgment right there. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. So it's like a court, it's like an assembly. And that's the basic idea for exploring how allusions in the play or decision-making in the play, or even where people come from, what neighborhoods they come from in the play, in Aristophanes, reveal things. I'll give you one example. Aristophanes himself, we know, comes from a neighborhood. It's called a deme, D-E-M-E, in Athenian political parlance, which is right downtown, called Kourethanaion. His major opponent, at least in the stylization of the play, is the demagogue Cleon, who comes from the same neighborhood. And we know that Cleon's father ran a tannery not far from the neighborhood. And we also know from inscriptions that survive that people were up in arms against this tannery for polluting the local river. So there's all kinds of infighting neighborhood issues, or there's rural issues, people in the outlying districts versus people downtown, what policies they want. You get into kind of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. It's perfect kind of urban localized comedy as well. So it's not quite the same as talking about national political issues in the way that Stephen Colbert would. It's more like maybe David Letterman talking about stuff in New York City.
Got it. I see. So it would be the, like Letterman then, it would be local New York stuff as well as at the national level?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Because what happens in New York happens elsewhere.
Yeah.
But it's also, some of the in-jokes, even now, if you ask somebody in, Idaho what such and such a joke meant on Letterman in the 1990s, they would be clueless because they wouldn't think of, the mayor of New York at the time or the issues on the subway or rats or something like that. So it's real local. All comedy is local. It's like all politics is local, as Tip O'Neill used to say.
All comedy is local. And all
politics there's a reference that I bet you don't get. Tip O'Neill?
I'm aware of the name.
Okay. But again, anybody coming from Boston like myself would know this guy.
Yeah.
So politics is local and comedy is local in these terms. In the Aristophanes comedy is real local.
Right.
But of course, that causes big problems for how you translate it.
Right. Got it. So you were just sort of talking about the space of the theatre. Now, did I misunderstand that the way you were describing it? It painted an image in my head that everything was open. So if people are making policy, if politicians are making policies, you can walk by and you could see them sitting there doing that. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean well, just to compare assembly and theater, they're both in big open air slopes on a hill, one on the Acropolis, one on the Pnyx across the street, maybe, a couple 100 meters. Anybody can go and attend, it seems. You did need a ticket at some point to get into the space of the Theater of Dionysus, but then they made tickets available through kind of special fund.
Sorry, Professor, I don't mean to interrupt you, but you're breaking up there slightly.
I'm breaking up. Yeah,
oh, there you go.
I'm not sure what's...
Perfect.
Is this okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it seems to be the direction in which I point the phone here.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you.
So where did I stop?
We were talking about you were talking about tickets.
Yeah, so you don't need a ticket to get into the assembly, but basically they're the same structure. Bunch of people, 5,000, 6,000 people. Male citizens, of course, in the assembly have the right to. Anybody can stand up and voice his opinion. Huh. In the theater, probably women and children are there, although we're not quite sure. But also lots of male citizens. So they're kind of homologous groups. And basically they're the same group because the male citizens who would go to the assembly one day would be in the theater the next day. So they share all of these group critical, judgmental venues.
Oh, wow. So would that be like the U.S. Congress being essentially an open building that you could walk by?
Yeah. Or let's make it even better. The U.S. Congress is in the open air there. Yeah. And then they go across the street all together to go to a show which makes fun of the U.S. Congress. That's the sort of tension. Okay. If you could imagine that, I would love to see that in on Capitol Hill, right?
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
There was that comedy group, the Capitol Steps, you remember?
Yes.
And they would do little skits about politics, but it was nothing like going to a theater with 5,000 people. But yeah, they're all open air.
Right, wow, okay. That's very interesting. I didn't know that. And then so then just thinking more, just a little bit more about because I took, when I read the sentence, all comedy related to the democratic practices of Athens, my initial reaction, I guess I misread it, was how comedy can have an impact on democracy.
Oh yeah, well that's part of it too. So the first step is really to to realize the analogy among court system, which was a huge political machine,
Yes.
assembly, which was where things really happened. You made policy, basically made foreign policy and urban policy.
Yeah.
It's a city-state. And then the theater. So the theater, let's say somebody like Aristophanes puts on a play that makes fun of the demagogue Cleon, that's going to have an instant impact. And we know when he put on a play in 427, we don't have that particular play, but it made fun of Cleon, the local demagogue at the time, after Pericles had died. And Cleon was so enraged that he took Aristophanes to court. And, Aristophanes won. But you could imagine there are folks in the court, jurors, because any Athenian citizen could be a juror, who had probably seen the play the year before. So it's really intense crossing of boundaries. These plays could have an impact on national policy, urban policy, by making fun of people. Now, we can't always connect the dots and say, oh yeah, play X, influenced policy Y the next year.
Right.
But there's certain local characters who get made fun of again and again. The one possible thing where we can say it's a smoking gun, as you know, is the Clouds of Aristophanes, where he makes fun of Socrates. Socrates, some 24 years later, is up on trial for corrupting the youth. And in his defense speech, Socrates says, you know why you put me on trial? It's that play of Aristophanes that you all saw back in 24 years ago that made fun of Socrates. That's really why you're against me, isn't it? So maybe it worked there. They put Socrates to death because many of the jurors probably had seen the play, or their parents had seen the play, and they thought of Socrates in these parodistic, satirical ways, as a kind of crank.
Wow! But it took 24 years to get to that point, though. It's not like we saw the play the next week.
That's right. They don't rush out with torches and say, we're going to burn down Socrates' house.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's complicated by the fact that we're pretty sure Socrates and Aristophanes were friends. In the work of Plato, the Symposium, they're all at a dinner party together. So we're not really sure. I have other ideas on what might have been going on there, but it doesn't seem to be Aristophanes is out to take down. It would be like somebody today, putting Bill Clinton on trial because of a comedy that was produced in 1990 or something. Yeah. Or
maybe even the movie The American President, because it was Michael Douglas playing a presidential character who falls in love with or has an affair with, I forget which now. I think it was an Annette Bening's character or something like that.
Yeah, vaguely familiar, yeah.
Right. And then using that, or there was another movie with John Travolta back in the day, I forget the name of it, and he was Primary Colors, and he played a character that everyone basically said was Clinton. So it's like...
Oh, right.
And I didn't see the movie or read the novel that it was based on, but everyone was sort of saying at the time it was like a Clinton character. So it would essentially be like Bill Clinton being put on trial now because of that movie, or him referencing that movie.
Right, which seems unlikely. Then again, Greeks do have long memories and a history of vengeance. But I think there are a lot of other things going on. It didn't help that Socrates was supporting some people who were thought to be against democracy. So, after the Athenians lose the war with Sparta in 404, lots of ill feelings come out.
Okay, so they lost the war, and that was in the final decades of Athens, right? You were saying, and then what happened after that?
Well, it's an interesting thing. We think of it as, Athens is gone, but actually the Athenian basic functions of the Athenian democracy kept going. They had, however, overlords or overseers who were Spartans and other allies of Spartans. So the Athenians don't really get totally taken over by an outside power until the later 4th century, when the great people.
Oh, I've just lost you there again, Professor. Sorry.
Yep, we breaking up again.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, there's kind of wonky reception here. I'm not sure what it was, but
that's okay.
I'm saying is that Athens continues, and they continue producing tragedies and comedies for a couple of hundred years. And we know that there were many comedians and comic writers after Aristophanes, like his son.
Oh, okay.
He had 3 sons, and they all produced comedies. Unfortunately, we don't have any of those comedies. And then in the 320s BC, Menander starts a kind of new form, which we call new comedy, and it's basically sitcom.
Right.
It's totally unlike the old stuff.
Right.
But so comedy keeps going. Aristophanes produced at least 2 plays in the 4th century, in 391 and in probably 388 or so. 2 of his later plays. For most people, they're a little bit less funny than the 5th century plays.
Okay.
But he's still at work.
Right. Right. And Athens keeps going.
Yeah. Athens has its courts and its assembly and the theater.
And were you saying that they were taken over by someone?
Well, there's lots of seesaw action. They have, after 404, they have Spartan overseers. I mean, it's not like a regime of jackbooted Spartans come in and shut things down. They had a very light touch, and after all, they are all Greeks.
Right.
And then later in the 4th century, a regime which is basically associates and descendants of Alexander the Great takes over, and they have a certain chilling effect, but they still support the arts. And then Athens, becomes a sort of backwater, but even through the time of the Roman Empire, it's still the place you send your kids to go to the university. That's where the Roman elite get educated in Athens.
Oh, wow.
But they're not producing new plays, in the 1st century AD, as far as we know. They're rerunning a lot of the old ones.
Right. Interesting. Okay. I think that's pretty much it from what I wanted to go over with you. This has been very enlightening for me.
Well, it's always fun to try to spread the word about this stuff.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, I've got one final question I wanted to ask you. And that question is this: knowing what you know about Aristophanes' work, and the modern day comparisons that we mentioned earlier, do you feel there are any lessons that you wish modern comedies or modern comedians could learn from his work? And what I mean beyond just doing an adaptation.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I did think about this. And you know what I did to help me crystallize my thoughts? I looked at, I Googled 10 best comedies, right?
Yeah.
And there are tons and tons of listicles about almost all of those comedies, like Airplane or Anchorman, are a kind of stringing together of little funny things, right?
Yeah.
So they're jokey. They're not particularly overtly political, and they lack the number one thing that Aristophanes was brilliant at, which is the great idea. Charlie Chaplin, I think, was better at great idea plays. By this I mean, there's the piece of Aristophanes. The character has a great idea to mount a gigantic dung beetle and fly to heaven to confront Zeus. Or the Acharnians, right? Dicaeopolis has a great idea to go make his own private peace with the Spartans. Or the birds. Two Athenians have a great idea to go to the edge of the world and found another city-state out there where the birds are. So these great ideas give you a real parabola, comic plot, which takes you through the whole play. And the one that I thought of that was a kind of great idea play, although it's more, the character doesn't have agency, is Groundhog Day.
Yes.
So it's a high concept. His dilemma is to escape Groundhog Day. But we don't really have great idea comedies. And
right.
If you could combine a great idea comedy with a political point, maybe Wag the Dog is the closest we come to that.
Right. And what about something like, I know we're going back to Chaplin, but The Great Dictator?
Yeah, that's a good example where, there's a lot of parody, there's a lot of political content, obviously, when you have Chaplin as Hitler. And the great idea, I can't frankly remember whether it succeeds or not. I'm thinking modern times instead. But yes, Chaplin, generally, he got that concept of the kind of high concept, one big thing we're going to do.
Right.
And then the little guy wins, which is another Aristophanic motif.
Right. Because you mentioned Groundhog Day, and my knowledge of the development of that screenplay was that at some point the story was supposed to span 1,000 years.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and obviously they went, can't do that. We'll just, knock it all down. And there's no reference to it. But it might have been interesting from an Aristophanic point of view to have that concept that the whole thing takes place over 1,000 years, maybe.
Yep. Exactly. I think Aristophanes, if he was in the writer's room, would say, no, don't shrink it. Let's go big, right?
Right.
So they were crazy guys, you can imagine, and they know what the rival comedian is trying to put on. It reminds me of that movie about Gilbert and Sullivan, maybe now about 20 years ago, and the sort of the feel of having, putting on a musical in London or light opera, and knowing what you're competing against, and plotting and going around, stealing people's props and that kind of stuff. That's what my movie about Aristophanes would be most like.
Was that the movie Topsy Turvy you were talking about?
Yeah, that's the one. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Wow. Okay, that's really interesting. So having a really big idea that connects to a lot of people, having something
and having to keep it secret so that your rival doesn't scoop you on the idea and win the prize.
Right.
And I still insist, though, seriously, that The Life of Aristophanes could be a great movie. There was one put on, I think BBC had it, called I, Aristophanes, but it was not great. It was a sort of one-man show, it seemed.
Yeah. It seems that a lot of the times when they do something like that, they just take an idea going, oh yeah, this is Aristophanes, or yeah, this is, I don't know, say Moliere, and then they just do something else entirely, and you think, well, there's all this real material about this person's life, and you just completely ignored it.
Exactly.
And then you're just using this name because a handful of people might know who that is.
Right.
And, or maybe more so in France with Moliere, I'm not sure. But, it seems a shame that I think you're right. There could be a really interesting Aristophanic movie about him.
Yep.
But done
using staged bits of the plays and, just going over the top. There's no reason we can't have that except we don't have millions of dollars to produce it at the moment.
Right. And it could be done like an Aristophanic play.
Yeah, the whole thing would have the sort of parabola that Athens itself has as a democracy, and which in mini form you could.
I'm just losing you again.
Whoops.
That's all right.
Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, but this is just to fantasize about
Yeah, go ahead.
how one could do it.
Okay. So just do a movie about his life like one of his plays would have been.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, really, really interesting. Okay. I think that's pretty much all I wanted to ask you, really. You've been more than generous with your time. I really, truly appreciate it.
Well, it's so good to talk to someone knowledgeable about comedy and with interest. And good luck with all of that. And
thank you.
If at any point I can advise, I'm happy to shoot emails back and forth or talk.
Wonderful, wonderful. I really appreciate that. My thing is, I think, inspired by the last question that I asked you, I saw a number of articles over the summer saying comedy was dead, at the box office, we need to do things differently, and I've been thinking about it for about a year or so. There are a number of things that I really enjoy. I like comedy that swears, I like cursing, I like all the rude stuff, but I also like other things. I like Coward, I like Restoration, I like Shakespeare. And, I was thinking selfishly that I don't feel all my tastes are being catered to.
Yeah.
And I figured I can't be the only person. And that's what my initial idea came from. And I thought, well, there's got to be other. And then I thought about the history of comedy in general. And I thought, well, is it interesting, do today's comedy writers and comedians, how much of an awareness do we have about our ancestry, our history? Is there anything we can learn? Do people like yourself have this information? And you're sitting there going, oh, I wish that they would just do X and it would take it somewhere else, or if they just learned, something that Aristophanes had, which is why I asked you that question, they would take the comedy somewhere else. It would take it to a different level or whatever that is. So I thought, well, as a passion project for me to try to connect with as many different people who have expertise, whether it's performers, directors, authors, or professors like yourself in these different areas, and then just put that information out there.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I agree we need a kind of comic renaissance.
Right.
And, the stuff that I find funniest these days is, frankly, Family Guy and Robot Chicken. I don't know if you're familiar with Robot Chicken.
I am familiar with both of those.
But I think they have a certain amount of just wild, obscene energy that the rest of the profession could use. But by the same token, here they are sort of ghettoized on late night TV and not out there with a live audience of 5,000 people. So bringing back the kind of social activist aspects of, or just huge live publicity of comedy, I think that could be a shot in the arm.
Yeah, and I appreciate that tastes change, trends change, and things move on. But then there's all this history is just lying about the place, or laying about the place, and it's just sort of there, and we just seem to keep reinventing the wheel. And hey, I've come up with something. It's surrealism. Well, guess what? That stuff's been around for thousands of years. It's not.
Yeah. We need a comic university where one could major in comic studies.
Right.
I would be happy to be the dean of such a place. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, that sounds a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Well, best of luck, as I say, and thanks
you
for taking the time. And I look forward to the results.
No problem at all. Again, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks, Professor.
Have a good day.
You too. Thanks. Bye now. This is the end of this interview. If you'd like to hear more interviews, please check out our website, comedyqna.com. That's the word comedy, the letter Q, the letter N, the letter A.com. Thanks very much for listening.